Hey everybody, you are listening to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. My name is Noah and I'll be your host. Over the course of however long this show goes, we will be diving into anything and everything related to the largest school system in the US. We'll cover it all, from teacher preparation and the many alternatives to traditional teacher prep, to the history of standardized testing in the city, to policies impacting COVID-19 response in schools. Much like a good lesson plan, I hope to make the show responsive to what you're looking for in a podcast about the New York City Department of Education and the people and processes involved in teaching New York City children. To keep the conversation going, you can reach out with questions, feedback, and ideas for future shows at professionaldevelopmentpodcast@gmail.com. And I promise I will get back to you. As this is our first episode together, I think it's appropriate that we do a bit of getting to know one another. You, the listener, find yourself here for one of many possible reasons. I'm thinking of you perhaps as a fellow educator. You might teach in the city somewhere, perhaps in the same borough where I teach, the Bronx, perhaps in the borough that I call home, Queens. Maybe you don't teach in New York but are thinking of moving here. Perhaps you have no real interest in the city at all, but you are following the goings-on of the country's largest school system because of the impacts they might have on the school system where you work. The initial idea for this show was born of my realization that I hear my colleagues ask the same questions over and over again. And I hear different answers to these questions depending on who is answering. Some questions have fairly simple answers, yet entire professional development sessions are devoted to responding to them. Sometimes these PD sessions result in more questions without ever answering the initial question. The title for the show is thus a little tongue-in-cheek, as it is not by any stretch of the imagination meant to be professional development, but rather something of a solution to these seemingly endless and more or less useless sessions. My goal with this show is to explore a question in each episode, research it thoroughly, and bring you the best possible answer, whether it is a simple and definitive answer or a well-curated list of resources you can use in finding an answer that is specific to your particular circumstances. I'm also thinking of you as a parent. I'm imagining you as one of my students' parents, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity this show will afford me to help translate some of the pages upon pages of information distributed by the New York City Department of Education that never reach you. You deserve to have all of the information that teachers have. And teachers deserve to have all the information that administrators have, and administrators deserve to have all the information that the chancellor and mayor have. For that reason, I will leverage all of the tools at my disposal to curate and interpret the most trustworthy sources I can find. Lately, the most up-to-date information seems to reach administrators and teachers at the same time as the general public, via the mayor's Twitter account. And the paper of record seems to oscillate between loving adoration for teachers in schools and a strong bias against teachers as workers. More on this later in the episode. But I will scour these and other sources in the research that I bring to you. I will also be sure to keep jargon to a minimum where possible and teach into any terms that do not have a direct analog in plain English. There are no outsiders when it comes to education, so we should use language that brings everybody into the conversation rather than keeping people out. I am also thinking of you as an audience, and of this as a show, a form of entertainment. You deserve clean, well-mixed audio, thoughtful writing, and original music. I came to this medium first as a listener, and only much later as a creator. The subject matter is important, but that does not necessarily mean it should be forced to stand on its own without any consideration for the art of storytelling and sound design. I am a New York City teacher by trade, and I enjoy research. These facets make me a reasonably good candidate for putting on the show, but that said, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of New York City public school teachers who are interested in researching and turnkeying this information. So why am I the one doing it? Well, I'm not just any kind of New York City public school teacher, I'm a music teacher. and I love audio stuff. The music you'll hear in each episode will be my original stuff unless otherwise noted, and all of the editing, mixing, and mastering will be my handiwork. The labor part of this labor of love is particularly suited to my skills and interests, but my hope is that the product will appeal more generally to you, the listener, who, like I said, arrived here for one of many possible reasons. I promise to keep the autobiographical content to a minimum on the show because I think the thing that brings us together here, education in New York City, is a lot more interesting than I am. But in the interest of transparency, I will tell you a little about myself. My name is Noah, and as I have mentioned, I'm a New York City public school teacher. I teach music to grades 6 through 12 at a small neighborhood school in the South Bronx. I'm beginning year 5 in the fall of 2021. I was recently awarded tenure, which we will cover in one of the early episodes of the show, as a prime example of a subject about which everybody has questions with simple answers, yet countless hours of professional development result in no clear answers to these questions. I've been in the city since 2015 when I arrived to do coursework in music and music education at Teachers College. Before that, I coached rowing for a year at my alma mater, Colby College in Waterville, Maine. And before that, I taught music at the Gandhi Ashram School in Kalimpong, West Bengal. That was my first job out of college and a really formative experience for me in that I fell in love with teaching that year. Prior to heading to India, I had been a double major in music and environmental policy, and I didn't have a clear idea of what I would do after college. But all of my priorities really fell into place once I started teaching. This is as good a place as any to segue into the main content of today's episode, and the namesake for the episode, which is the phrase, "You're a teacher?" which many, if not all of us, have heard in one form or another. The italicization of the word teacher in conversation conveys something different depending on the person asking the question. Incredulity from peers who expected you to work in finance or a similar field requiring less education but paying significantly more. Feigned excitement from relatives attempting to hide their disappointment, or worse, contempt for you for having joined what they suspect to be a liberal brainwashing operation. Or perhaps actual esteem from acquaintances remembering their own teachers with fondness and considering the formative impact that education had on their lives. The main question we're exploring in today's episode is, how does the public view our profession? Anecdotally, I know generally what my small sphere of influence thinks about my job. I'm lucky enough to have an aunt who was a school principal for many years, so much of my extended family appreciates the importance of teachers and education generally, even if they have a somewhat skewed idea of what I'm doing on a daily basis. A lot of my friends, on the other hand, think I'm a sucker. These seem like totally contradictory perceptions of our work, but upon closer examination, they are more similar than one might think. While my parents think of me as selflessly caring for children in the poorest congressional district in the country with little to no public support, fighting an uphill battle against the ravages of late capitalism and unjust social institutions, a good thing that someone should do, my friends think of me as selflessly caring for children in the poorest congressional district in the country with little to no public support, fighting an uphill battle against the ravages of late capitalism and unjust social institutions. And what kind of rube would do that when there is so much easier and better paid work out there for a college-educated white male? I think both perceptions are wrong. I'm not a saint or a martyr, nor am I a fool. We teachers provide a necessary service to society. None of us chose this work because it is difficult, underpaid, and thus undervalued, and sometimes fraught socially and politically. Rather, we chose it in spite of these things, which have nothing to do with the essence of the work itself, because we see through to what makes the work important. The work itself is not about masochism, but about doing important work, providing a service that has to be there. We might put up with being undervalued and mocked by politicians, either openly or more subtly through policy decisions that make our lives more difficult. But we would certainly be much happier if we could just do the important work without having to put up with the abuse. In other words, the abuse is not inherent to the importance of the work. So, what is it about the work that is so important? This is a very good question, and one that we will address throughout the course of the show as it develops over time. Now, I have no data to back this up, just more anecdotes. But the individuals with whom I have worked who seem most inspired by the savior complex we might associate with a lot of the movies about teachers and school do not seem to last very long in the profession. I suspect this is because teaching is so very unlike the movies in this respect. We never get a montage of trust building and turning lemons into lemonade. There is no candlelight vigil outside a courthouse when we get into trouble. Your toughest student is probably not going to hang back after the bell one day to thank you for helping them turn their life around. As a brief aside, I love bad movies about school, and I'm really looking forward to bringing you some movie reviews as the show develops. Anyway, teaching is hard work, and there is very little in the way of short-term payoffs. So if you come here for stand and deliver, you are likely to be disappointed. But all of this is just my personal experience. Just the emotions that bubble up anytime somebody learns that I work as a music teacher in the South Bronx and responds that they loved Meryl Streep in Music of the Heart, or asks, how long will it be before I leave the classroom for more lucrative work? In other words, not a very scientific answer to the question concerning the public perception of teachers. I was interested in zooming out and developing a broader understanding of the multitude of perceptions of teachers that inform how people relate to us. Whether it's the conversation that follows the question, what do you do for work? Or the policy decisions that determine what sorts of working conditions we can expect, people have opinions about teachers, and those opinions impact our lives. This is our first episode, and while the Patreon is up and running, I do not yet have the means to fund a really extensive survey campaign. That said, if this sort of thing interests you, be sure to sign up for the Patreon at patreon.com/professional development and tell your colleagues and friends about the show, and maybe that will be within grasp in the next few months. In the meantime, I figured I would look for an answer to my question in print. So I looked into the papers with the highest circulation rate in New York City. Those include the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, Metro New York, and New York Daily News. I limited my scope to articles from the past 2 years containing the word teacher. Now, this was not the most refined way of mining for the sources that would be the most informative to my review, but I wanted to be sure not to miss anything important. That said, I realized early on that it would take weeks to sift through every article in all 5 papers. So for this initial review, I chose the paper most likely to contain favorable information about teachers, which I figured would be the New York Times, and just looked at content from the past few months. I certainly haven't given up on looking at everything brought to us by the New York Post, easily the most entertaining paper on offer in New York aside from maybe the Epoch Times or anything else of similar journalistic integrity, but these expansions to my literature review will have to wait for subsequent episodes. Anyway, I scrolled through hundreds of headlines and opened every article that struck me as having anything to do with education. After reading each article and assigning it a value 1 to 5 based on the stance of the article towards teachers, I tabulated the date, title, stance, and a brief summary in a running document that I could use to interpret my data later on. Fast forward, and here's what I found. Having read through the few dozen articles published in the New York Times over the past few months that had anything to do with teachers, I can state fairly confidently that the paper of record is not publishing anything openly antagonistic of teachers. I scored each article from 1 to 5, with 1 being extremely critical of teachers and 5 being extremely celebratory and 3 being neutral. The average, when all was said and done, was just under 3. It's like 2.8 something. Most scores were 3, with a few more 2s than 4s, 1 5, and once I filtered out op-eds, no 1s. Upon closer examination, however, I realized that there might be something a bit more nefarious to what I was reading, something that didn't at first meet the eye. The bulk of the articles were seemingly neutral, but in mentioning teachers in a neutral way, it was sort of as if they were just in the room and not active in one way or the other. For example, we're sort of in the tail end of a debate about critical race theory, or CRT. A lot of articles mention teachers in the context of discussing what is to be taught in school, but the teachers were presented sort of amorphously. Policymakers, pundits, and public-facing academics, the 3 Ps, were on the record by name with one stance or another, but teachers were the nameless, apolitical, and passive pawns, 2 Ps, implementing the will of whomever wins the culture war. Their students were the equally nameless, apolitical, passive recipients of whichever narrative wins out in the context in which political action takes place, completely removed from the classroom. This, I think, was a very important insight to draw from this set of articles that popped up over the course of several weeks in June and July. It offered me a frame of reference in looking at articles dealing with other topics related to teachers. Again and again, I found that teachers were mentioned but not interviewed. Why is this problematic? Well, think about it. When an article deals with specific subject matter, in which the reader and writer are likely not experts, it is incumbent on the journalist to interview an expert who can shed some light on the topic. Yet, in article after article about school, there were interviews with parents, politicians, and sometimes administrators, but rarely with teachers, suggesting that we are not considered to be experts. We thus avoid some of the rancor pointed at political actors on one side or another of a political question, such as that in the CRT debate or Alabama's recently lifted ban on yoga in schools. But the corollary to our apolitical status is that we are equally inexpert in our work. So much so that journalists must go to politicians and parents to discuss what goes on in our classrooms. One way in which teachers were repeatedly implicated as political actors had to do with the return to in-person learning. A line I lifted from an article in May might easily have been copy-pasted to a dozen articles. It said, "Teachers' unions have been one key barrier to a broader opening this school year, accused of slowing reopening timelines as they sought strict virus mitigation measures even after teachers began to be vaccinated in large numbers." Teachers and their unions as barrier is a common thread in a lot of articles. We get a similar sentiment from an article from March entitled, "I've lost a lot of faith. Suburban parents push schools to reopen faster." Teachers are obstacles to in-person instruction, forcing affluent suburban parents to enroll their children in private schools. The image of powerful unions is repeatedly invoked in these articles, but never an interview with a powerful teacher/power broker. There is never the faintest mention of the very real reasons why many teachers had to fight tooth and nail to switch to remote instruction, for the health and safety of the children and workers who would otherwise be sitting in cramped, poorly ventilated classrooms, unavoidably sharing germs with each other via the air they had no choice but to breathe. What is most egregious about the many articles that frame a narrative of teachers versus everybody else in the remote versus in-person debate is that it does not take account of the fact that most teachers do not want to be remote. In my anecdotal accounting of colleagues and friends in the world of education, none of us enjoys remote teaching. We just happen to recognize that it is the only way to avoid dying or killing our students and their families in the midst of a global pandemic. Most of us worked harder than we had ever worked in the midst of remote instruction, and without the payoffs we usually get in the course of our day. Greetings in the hallway, a student's smile, their pleasant surprise at the sudden onset of comprehension, and every other element of our job that makes it worth it fell away when we traded our hours in the building for hours behind a computer. We were in the safety of our homes, but many of us in New York City live in closets. And even those of us who have been in the game long enough to afford a 2-bedroom with a roommate or a house in the suburbs stopped enjoying our homes as much as we used to while we were confined to them. If given the opportunity to answer a journalist's question, that is what the majority of us would say. But we were not given the opportunity in these articles. Instead, the narrative is that we are the only holdouts against what might have been a timely, safe, and on the whole totally preferable return to school. Why? Well, they don't say exactly, but what is the implication usually when someone doesn't want to go into work? They must be lazy. Anyway, the scope of this review was extremely limited, but I look forward to following up in subsequent episodes with reviews of articles taken from key moments in the pandemic, as well as expanding into other papers. Already I have some follow-up questions, like when did teachers cease to be the go-to experts in all things school-related? Is this part of the process of deprofessionalization, or is it that we were never considered professional to begin with? Is our job only political when we are considering a strike, or are there other actions in which we partake where we temporarily cease to be passive pawns and implementers of someone else's politics? As I mentioned earlier, I only looked at a few pages of results from the New York Post before deciding to keep those articles cordoned off and reserved for an episode with a more comedic feel. But I think it is important to look into since it does have a fairly wide circulation. So stay tuned for follow-up episodes looking into that and more. This has already been a pretty news-heavy episode by design, but I'm planning to wrap up each episode with the most recent news concerning New York City schools. This week's news update comes in the form of an email from the Chancellor, Misha Porter. Dear colleagues, I hope this summer is treating you well. As we begin to gear up for the 2021-22 school year, I hope you're all getting time to restore before heading into our year of homecoming. This morning, the mayor made an important announcement about health and safety requirements for all city workers, which includes all DOE employees. Effective September 13th, 2021, all DOE employees must have proof they are vaccinated for COVID-19, or if not vaccinated, be tested for COVID-19 on a weekly basis. Employees who have received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine by September 13th will not have to submit weekly test results while they complete their full vaccination. We encourage all staff who have not completed their COVID-19 vaccination to do so as soon as possible. More information about locations where New Yorkers can receive a vaccine for COVID-19 can be found at vaccinefinder.nyc.gov. To be fully vaccinated by September 13th, employees would need to receive the following vaccines by these dates. Moderna, first dose by August 2nd. Pfizer, first dose by August 9th. Johnson & Johnson, single dose by August 30th. The city is also reinforcing its current mask guidance for city workers. Unvaccinated employees must wear a mask indoors at their worksite, while vaccinated city employees who do not interact with the public are currently not required to wear masks at their workstations, though they may choose to continue to do so. City workers who interact with the public, including students and their families, must continue to wear masks at all times, regardless of vaccination status. In addition, all employees must still wear face coverings when entering the buildings, traveling to their workspace, and in elevators. We will continue to share updates on health and safety policies and protocols for schools, as well as borough and central offices leading up to the first day of school. Thank you for all you are doing to keep yourself, your loved ones, your colleagues, and the students you serve safe. In partnership, Misha. So, is this a vaccine mandate? No, not at all. The options are either to be fully vaccinated on the way to full vaccination or submit to weekly COVID tests, which those of us who have been teaching in person since early spring have already been submitting to. The mask mandate remains in place, which makes sense since most of our students are not yet old enough for the vaccine, and even if they are, they're not required to be vaccinated. As our time together draws to a close in this, our first episode, I want to thank you for tuning in and invite you once again to get in touch at professionaldevelopmentpodcast@gmail.com. For bonus episodes, written form essays, and all sorts of other bonus content, check out patreon.com/professionaldevelopment. My biggest near-term goal for the show is to start bringing on guests with insight about each topic we explore, but I want to hold off on inviting people until I can pay them for their labor. So let your colleagues know what we're doing here, and the sooner we have a few subscribers, the sooner I'll be able to expand to include some guests. Maybe you will be one of those guests. If you have some insight on a topic that you would like to share, please write in. For a totally free means of supporting the show, subscribe to us wherever you do your podcast listening and leave a nice review so that the algorithm shows us some love. Thanks again, and see you back here next week.